Okay, folks, so today we're going to take a look at the June 2024 Global History Regents, and questions 1 and 2 here correspond with a political cartoon titled The Agricultural Revolution. Now, if you don't remember anything about this, the Agricultural Revolution took place in Great Britain, beginning in the mid to late 17th century, which is the 1600s, so the mid to late 1600s. And a lot of historians credit this revolution for creating like the conditions necessary for the Industrial Revolution to happen. So without the Agricultural Revolution, you wouldn't have, in theory, an industrial revolution, okay? Because the agricultural revolution is going to create like this abundance of food and increase the population and cause a lot of people to migrate to cities in search of factory jobs. But we'll get to all that in a second. Okay, so let's take a look at the cartoon first. Always figure out what's happening in the picture before you start analyzing some questions, right? So we see farm machinery, artificial fertilizers, so machines on the farms, fertilizers, probably to help increase the amount of crops being grown, right? To better the health of the crops, I guess you could say. Crop rotation, which is a technique to make sure that you're not exhausting the nutrients of the land, right? You're always ensuring that some of the land is going to be able to grow food. You have here scientific breeding, so maybe some kind of early genetic engineering of food crops. New varieties, so new types of food being grown, improved quality, and greater yield. Okay, yield in this context means like more. So a greater yield means we're producing more food, right? And that's what the agricultural revolution is all about. New technologies and sciences to increase the amount of food being produced. So let's take a look at question number 1. This illustration can best be used to, okay, so I can prove which one of these things to be true using this picture. So choice 1 says, describe factors that hindered British industrialization. Okay, this is a word that comes up a lot on the Regents, this word hindered. Make sure you know the word hindered. To hinder something means to slow down or stop. So we cannot pick this as our answer, right? These factors don't hinder industrialization. These factors are going to help industrialization happen, okay? Because again, with the agricultural revolution, it's going to allow more food to be produced. More food means a higher population. And since you're going to be using machines on the farms, you don't need as many farm workers anymore. So a lot of those farm workers, they might be getting laid off from their jobs, right? And they're going to get up and migrate to the cities in search of factory work. So that's going to help industrialization, right? Because you're going to have this large group of people desperate enough to take those low-paying factory jobs. That's going to help industrialization happen. So this won't hinder industrialization, it's going to help industrialization. So cross off choice number 1. Choice number 2 is the answer, but let's look at 3 and 4. Explain the decline of enclosure movements. Okay, enclosure is something that happens at the same time as the agricultural revolution. And I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details about this right now, but basically what happens is around this time period, again, the mid to late 1600s, the British government is allowing people to take private ownership over basically all of the land of Britain for the most part. So without getting too much into the 9th grade history, during the Middle Ages, a lot of land in Great Britain was like common land. So many different people could have their sheep or goats graze on that land. You could plant stuff on that land. It wasn't like privately owned, it was shared ownership. But by this time period, the agricultural revolution, the British government is allowing private individuals to acquire this land. And then what are you going to do? You're going to put a fence around your property, right? And you're going to try to maximize the output of that land in terms of producing crops. Okay, so we're not going to have a decline in enclosure. You're going to have an increase in the enclosure movement during this time period, okay? Because the government is allowing people to purchase land and fence it off, and they're getting away from that common pasture land, I guess you could say. Choice 4 here, depict daily life of British urban workers. Make sure you know this word urban. Okay, urban is cities. Suburban is kind of like, Westchester or Long Island, right? Not quite the city, not quite the country. And then you have the word rural, right? R-U-R-A-L. That means the countryside. Okay, so this is not going to depict life of the urban workers, right? It's not showing people living in cities. It's showing people living in rural communities, right? On the farms. So we're going to cross off choices 3 and 4. Number 2 is our answer. Illustrate advances in agriculture. Okay, these are the advances. Agriculture is the process of farming. So go ahead and make sure that you have number 2 as your answer for number 1. Question number 2 says, which claim is best supported by this illustration? Choice number 1 says, new technologies reduced the impact of farming on the environment. Well, I don't really think you can make that case here because we see the machines literally plowing through fields, right? Cutting down crops, chopping wheat. That seems to me like we're altering the environment or changing the environment. So new technologies are going to not reduce the impact of farming on the environment. It's probably going to increase the impact of farming on the environment, right? With new technologies, maybe your teacher went and told you about the seed drill. That's a machine that I like to talk about a lot. Basically, you attach a device to a tractor and it does the planting of the seeds for you, right? You just kind of drag it across the field. And if you're using a tractor to do that, you could plant a lot more food more quickly. So a lot of farmers are going to say, let's chop down some more trees and expand the amount of farmland available. So having those machines is going to increase the impact of farming on the environment, right? We're not going to reduce it. So cross off number 1. Choice 2 says, innovations in farming contributed to a drop in population. Absolutely not. Okay, when you have more farming, you're going to have more food. And historically speaking, whenever societies tend to have more food, populations are going to increase, right? Because you might, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one reason I like to talk about in class is if you have more food being produced, the price of food is going to go down, right? So your average everyday family might say, okay, I could afford to put food on the table. Maybe we can have another kid, right? Whereas if food is really expensive, they might go, we can't feed another mouth, right? So no more kids. So we're going to have an increase in population if we're going to have more farming technologies. Okay, so we're not going to have a drop in population. So cross off choice 2. 3 is our answer, but let's look at choice 4. Changes in farming prevented the growth of large-scale farms. I don't know. Sounds to me like we're going to have larger and larger farms because the machines are going to make it possible to make better use of more land than ever before. So we're going to have more large-scale farms, not less large-scale farms. So choice 3 is going to be our answer, right? Improved equipment, decrease the amount of human labor of farmers, right? When you have machines, you don't need as many human laborers on the farms. And this is, again, why the agricultural revolution drives the industrial revolution, because these people are going to get up and migrate away from rural societies and move to urban societies in search of factory jobs. And that's going to allow the industrial revolution to take place. Let's move on to questions 3 and 4. So questions 3 and 4 correspond with a source, and I always like to try to figure out who wrote the source or what the source is about. And it says here, Catherine the Great and Enlightened Despotism. Okay, so Catherine the Great hopefully is somebody you learned about when you were doing your Enlightenment unit. She was a leader of the Russian Empire in the 1700s. And if you're enlightened, quote unquote, it means you follow the policies or you accept some of the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Right? So think about people like John Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu. Right? So if you are enlightened, you maybe embrace some of the ideas of those people, right? Make sure you know your Enlightenment thinkers and Enlightenment ideas. And despotism is another way of saying absolute monarchs, okay? Which I know sounds kind of weird because these two terms don't really go together. But an enlightened despot is an absolute monarch who embraces some ideas of the Enlightenment, right? Maybe the absolute monarch does not embrace checks and balances in the government, but maybe an absolute monarch might go, you know what? I want my people to have freedom of religion. That's an enlightened idea, okay? So this source is going to be about how Catherine the Great was kind of like an enlightened despot, an absolute monarch that considered some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Let's take a look at the source together. Okay, it says, the serf question is commonly seen as the acid test of Catherine's sincerity, and her failure to solve it is taken as proof of insincerity. But Catherine was convinced, both on humanitarian and practical grounds, of the desirability of emancipation. So she's desiring to emancipate somebody. Who? The serfs. To emancipate means to free somebody. Okay, if you don't remember the term serfs, this goes back to like 9th grade history. Serfs or serfdom is the idea of a social class that's basically like a slave. Okay, not quite, because these people are not bought and sold at auction and they're not taken from faraway places most of the time. Okay, but they're treated almost like property. And if you're going to sell land, the serf is bound to that land and they're going to be expected to work for a new landlord once the sale is completed. Okay, so it's kind of a status of near slavery. So she wants to emancipate the serfs, or at least regulate the relationship between noble and serf, right? So maybe put some rules in place that make sure that the nobles cannot treat the serfs with disrespect, I guess, right? She voiced her beliefs clearly and often, publicly and privately. She roundly declared that unless we agree to alleviate the cruelties and to mitigate a condition intolerable for human beings, they themselves will take matters into their own hands, whether we like it or not. So I think she's saying here that this intolerable situation of the serfs being so miserable is going to lead someday to the serfs taking matters into their own hands. Maybe she's alluding to the fact that revolution might happen among the lower classes, right? And if you fast forward to like 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, I guess she was right. On the other hand, when it came to putting her wishes into action, Catherine was faced with almost unanimous disapproval of the nobility. So the nobles don't want to emancipate the serfs, right? They're going to lose out on their basically free labor. They don't want that. They, having won wide authority over the serfs from her predecessors, so the leaders of Russia before Catherine gave nobles greater control over serfs, these people were bent on exacting, meaning forcing, still more from Catherine herself, and had little patience with her liberal ideas, right? Liberal ideas meaning ideas about personal freedom, I guess you could say in this context, okay? So the nobles don't want change. They don't want new ideas. They don't want Enlightenment ideas. They want things to stay the same, right? They want control over the serfs. The gulf, meaning gap, between noble and serf had grown too wide for Catherine to bridge it. Faced with such an impasse, meaning you can't come to a decision, you can't fix the situation, she could do nothing. To push through her program with any prospect of success, she would have had to resort to the forcible methods of Peter the Great, an option that she had neither the inclination nor the power to take. Trapped in a historical process that was none of her making and which she could not control, Catherine was compelled to yield against her private judgment. Okay, so she did not feel comfortable forcing the nobles to do what she said. I guess she thought maybe they had too much power and maybe they wouldn't be able to be controlled and maybe they would try to take Catherine down. So she kind of let it be, even though her gut says this is the right thing to do. Hence the paradox or contradiction that under the most enlightened Russian ruler of the century, okay, so again, she likes Enlightenment ideas, the condition of the serfs underwent so marked and rapid a deterioration. The nobility demanded payment for their support of Catherine, and Catherine had to pay at the serfs' expense. Okay, so Catherine depended on support from the nobles, and who had to pay for this? The serfs, right? Because they were left to suffer because Catherine wanted to stay in power. All right, so kind of a catch-22 situation here. She wants to free the serfs, but she also wants to maintain control. And her desire to maintain control is what won in this situation here. So number 3 says, based on the passage, what issue was debated but not changed during the reign of Catherine the Great, right? This word reign here, R-E-I-G-N, is basically the time period in which a person is in power. Usually a dictator or a monarch is in power. Okay, so choice 1 says, and we're going to cross that one off, abolishing noble titles. Okay, noble titles means, again, going back to the Middle Ages, a king might say, okay, you are the Duke of whatever part of England or of France or of Russia. And that means you get a giant grant of land and you get to basically govern that land as you see fit. And then when you die, you can leave it to your son, your oldest son. She's not abolishing these things, right? And if anything, she's making sure the nobles are going to continue being happy. This would not make the nobles happy, all right? They're going to lose their rights to lands. So she's not doing those things. Choice 3, withholding pay from the nobility. Well, she doesn't mention that in the source, right? And again, the general theme of the source is make the nobles happy. This is not going to make the nobility happy. Choice 4 can't be correct because Catherine's power is not increasing. If anything, this shows that her power is either decreasing or remaining the same because she cannot get control over the nobility. She's afraid of them. So what issue are they debating? They're debating emancipating the serfs. Right? Whether or not to free them. She wants to do it, but she knows if she does it, she risks irritating the nobility, and that might cause her to lose power over or control over Russia. So we're going to pick choice 2 for question number 3. Question number 4 says, which claim is best supported by this passage? Look at choice 2. Monarchs rule with unquestioned authority. Can't pick that one. Okay, because the nobles are basically forcing her hand. They're basically telling her how it's going to be. So certainly she doesn't have full power over all the people, right? There are people questioning her decision-making process. So we crossed off choice 2. Crossed off choice 3. Nobility rarely have an impact on royal decisions. Well, they did have a major impact on this decision. So we cross off this one. Inequality was not a concern of monarchs. No, you cross it off, right? Because she's debating whether or not to free these people. She is concerned about the serfs to some extent, right? So she is concerned about inequality. She just doesn't take any action to figure it out or to stop it. So choice 1 is going to be our answer. Political and social changes can be difficult to bring about, right? She wants the changes. The nobility is preventing her from making those changes. So cross off 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 is your answer for question 4. Let's continue on. Okay, so questions 5 and 6 correspond with a nice short source written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Okay, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, right? These two guys wrote the Communist Manifesto. They're the ones that gave birth to ideas about communism. Okay, so make sure you remember some of your communist ideas. I'm not going to go over all of them right now, but basically some of the big ideas are that the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of inequality in industrialized societies. And one day, those poor factory workers, who were referred to as the proletariat in the Communist Manifesto, one day they're going to overthrow the capitalist class and take over the factories and take over the government and work to create a classless society where everything is equal. Okay, maybe a good idea on paper, right? Because you're not going to have inequality, but a really hard thing to put into practice. So let's take a look at questions 5 and 6. But first, let's look at the source, right? The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow, there's that idea, of all existing social conditions, right? You can only achieve your goals by overthrowing the people that are in charge. No changes are going to happen unless revolution comes first. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians, that's the working class in the factories, have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win, right? So kind of equating working in a factory to almost like being a slave. So you have to kind of break your chains and rise up and fix the situation. So question 5 says, what conditions inspired the writing of this passage? So another way of saying basically, what were the historical circumstances for this source? What had to come first? Look at choice number 2. It says government reforms to protect workers' rights. Well, if workers' rights are being protected and the government is making changes, they wouldn't argue that you need to have a revolution. That doesn't make any sense. So cross off 2. 3 says rise of powerful labor unions. Well, if powerful labor unions were happening, they would be working to protect workers and you wouldn't have a need for a revolution. So you crossed off choice 3. Decline of urban populations. If there was a decline in urban populations, that means, I suppose, that people are doing better, right? They have more income. They have the ability to move out to the suburbs and commute to work, which suggests a higher income. So if you have a higher income and you have a better standard of living, why the heck would you have a revolution? So you cross off 4. And that leaves us with choice 1, economic inequality in industrial cities, right? It's the poor working classes that are really suffering, right? And Karl Marx says that those poor factory workers have a job to do. They have to have a revolution against the status quo in order to achieve their goals. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution creates inequality among people, at least initially, and that leads to writings like the Communist Manifesto arguing for a revolution of the working class. Question 6. This is an easy one, hopefully. Which leader agreed with the philosophy in this passage? So basically you have to go through these people here and ask yourself which one supported communism in history. Hopefully Fidel Castro jumps out at you here, right? He's the one that led the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and made Cuba a communist society, right? So that should jump out at you. Hopefully it does, because the other answer choices here, some of them are tricky. Augusto Pinochet was a leader of Chile in the 1970s, and he was like the opposite of a communist. In fact, he did some pretty brutal and repressive things to people that were suspected of being communists at the time. So since he's so anti-communist, we're not going to pick him for choice 6. Jiang Jieshi was a nationalist leader of China in the early 1900s. He's a person that fought against Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War. Mao Zedong was the communist and he fought the communists, so he certainly does not support the philosophy of communism. Maximilien Robespierre was a person who argued for a radical implementation of the French Revolution, right? Getting rid of the absolute monarch and bringing in a republic, right? Where people's rights are protected. He went about that through some really sketchy means, right? The Reign of Terror happened under Robespierre, but his ideas were not communist ideas. Okay, he wanted a republic. So we crossed off choice 4. And that leaves us again with Fidel Castro. Remember, Fidel Castro, Cuban Revolution, communism, Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll come back to that stuff a little bit later on as well. Let's take a look at questions 7 and 8. Okay, so questions 7 and 8 correspond with a speech by Otto von Bismarck, 1862. Okay, when you think Otto von Bismarck, you think German unification. Okay, not to get too detailed with the review of this right now, but remember, before Otto von Bismarck, there was no quote-unquote Germany, right? In Central Europe, you had a bunch of independent states consisting mostly of people that spoke German and had a German culture, but there was no unity there. Okay, so Otto von Bismarck comes in as this nationalist thinking, I have a lot of pride in German culture. What would make the German culture better if it was stronger? Right? How do you make the German culture stronger? You have to unify the German people into one state, because then all the German people would be working together to further the goals of German people, right? That's the point of view of a German nationalist in the mid-1800s. The Italian nationalists had similar ideas. Maybe you remember people like Giuseppe Garibaldi or Giuseppe Mazzini or Count Camillo Cavour, right? Those are the Italian nationalists. But anyway, let's take a look here. Prussia's borders, according to the Vienna treaties of 1814 to 15, are not favorable for a healthy, vital state. Okay, so Vienna treaties. The Congress of Vienna is a series of meetings that took place after the downfall of Napoleon. And the goal there was to do a couple of things. One was bring back all the absolute monarchs that Napoleon basically bounced when he made his giant empire. And also they wanted to restore like a balance of power in Europe by kind of redrawing the map, making some states a little bit stronger than they were before to make sure that one state could not overpower another in Europe ever again. Bismarck here is arguing that Prussia is suffering as a result of this. Okay, Prussia was one of those German states in Central Europe prior to German unification. It doesn't exist anymore. It is not by speeches and majority resolutions that the great questions of the time are decided. That was the big mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood, right? That's his famous speech. How can we achieve the unification of German people? We're not going to ask people if they want to join a German state. We're not going to put it up for elections. No, we're going to force all the German states to join with Prussia to create a new Germany. Okay? So that's what they mean by, that's what Bismarck meant here by blood and iron. He's going to force Germans to join his new Germany with the goal in mind of uniting all German people under one government led by Prussia. Okay? This statement is most closely associated with which event? It's not the Industrial Revolution. Okay, this happens after the Industrial Revolution. 3, the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference took place in 1884. And that has to do with imperialism in Africa. So even though this might throw you off because Otto von Bismarck is German and Berlin is Germany, this has nothing to do with this. Choice 4 says Ukrainian Holodomor. This was a horrific event that happened in the 1930s when Joseph Stalin basically stopped Ukrainians from being able to eat. And that happened again in the 1930s, long after the unification of Germany, and this has to do with Ukrainians and Russians, not Germans. So what's our answer? Like I said, it's about German unity, so choice 2 is our answer. The opinion expressed in this statement was most likely influenced by, well, it's not fascist goals, because German fascists are like people like Adolf Hitler, and that happens in the 1930s and 40s, right? Long after Germany became a united state. Containment concerns are not our answer, because that's the Cold War time period, right? That's like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, okay, long after German unification. And that's really a competition between the US and the Soviet Union. Nationalistic feelings is our answer, but look at choice 4 here, appeasement policies. Appeasement is when the British and the French were giving in to Hitler in the years before World War II, right? Long after Germany became unified already. So this is showing Bismarck's nationalistic feelings here. Right? He wants to unite the Germans together into one state. Why? It would make the German people stronger. Why does he care? He's got pride in being German, right? You want your German people to be stronger? Let's come together, right? That's a feature of nationalism. So he's a nationalistic guy. He wants his country to be strong. So choice 3 for number 8. Let's move on. Okay, so questions 9 and 10 correspond with the source titled Excerpts from the Meiji Restoration of 1889, which is basically the same thing on the bottom here, right? Meiji Constitution of 1889. All right, and when I see Meiji Constitution 1889, I'm thinking Japan right away. Right? The Meiji Restoration period in Japan is when Japan starts to modernize their society by basically copying what the West was doing, right? Whatever was successful in places like France, Britain, Germany, the United States, we're going to bring those things over to Japan, right? Those nations in Europe and the US are successful. So if we can copy them, maybe we'll be successful too. And we'll be strong enough to make sure that no one's going to mess with us anymore, right? Because a couple of decades prior, Japan's next door neighbor, China, certainly suffered a lot at the hands of others, right? And Japan wanted to avoid the same fate. So this constitution reflects a lot of Western influence in Japan by 1889. Let's take a look at some of these together. The imperial throne shall be succeeded to by imperial male descendants according to the provisions of the imperial house law. Okay, so just like European countries, when a leader dies, the next male descendant takes over, right? That's a European idea. The emperor gives sanction to laws and orders them to be promulgated, which means developed and executed, right? So the emperor is going to have power over Japan. And that's a change, right? If you remember your World in 1750 unit, right? Before this, the emperor was kind of like a figurehead, like the queen or now the king of England, right? The shogun was the person who had a lot of power, not the emperor, but now the emperor is going to be the one that's powerful, right? So that's a change in Japanese history there. The emperor has the supreme command of the army and navy, right? So kind of like commander-in-chief. Sounds like an idea that maybe America had, right? The emperor declares war, makes peace, and concludes treaties. The emperor confers titles of nobility, rank, orders, and other marks of honor. Okay, so if the emperor wants to give a member of the nobility the title to a piece of land, the emperor has the right to do that. Sounds to me like absolutism here for sure, right? I don't see any checks and balances happening really. The conditions necessary for being a Japanese subject shall be determined by law. So the Japanese will determine who could be a citizen and who will not be able to be a citizen. No Japanese subject shall be deprived of his right of being tried by the judges determined by law. So you have the right to a trial if you're accused of a crime. That sounds a lot like the American Bill of Rights, right? Japanese subjects shall, within limits not prejudicial to peace and order and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects, enjoy freedom of religious belief. Good old freedom of religion, right? That's like Amendment number 1 in the U.S. Bill of Rights. It's also an idea from Voltaire during the Enlightenment, right? So certainly we see some American and European influence there as well. Finally, here it says, Japanese subjects shall, within the limits of law, enjoy the liberty of speech, writing, publication, public meetings, and associations, right? So basically the freedom of speech. Again, Voltaire. Again, Enlightenment. Again, European influence. So question 9. Which statement about Japan is best supported by this document? The people of Japan enjoyed great freedom while the power of the emperor was quite limited. I absolutely cannot pick this one. I don't see the emperor's power being limited here. Sounds to me like the emperor's power is limitless, right? They could do all sorts of things. So cross off number 1. The Japanese people could remove the emperor if their rights were not protected. It's not in the document. So it can't support choice 2 if it's not in the document. So cross off choice 2. I see nothing here about the people being able to have some kind of impeachment process or election. No, there are no elections, right? Male descendants take over. So cross off choice 2. Choice 3 says, the Emperor of Japan was required to seek counsel of the people before declaring war. I absolutely can't pick that one. Right? The emperor declares war, makes peace, concludes treaties. Nothing here about asking for permission. Right? So you cross off choice 3. And that leaves us with choice 4. The rights of the Japanese people were protected under law, but the emperor held supreme authority, right? So some freedoms are protected, but the emperor certainly could have all the power he wanted in this constitution. So number 4 is your answer for number 9. Number 10. What was the goal of Japan during the 19th century that most influenced the writing of this document? Right. So again, what's the goal of the Meiji Restoration, I guess you could say? Expanding its trade networks by water from Asia to the Western Hemisphere. This is not a time period where Japan was trying to do that. That's going to come a little bit later on once Japan becomes a modern country. But also, too, it says by water. So, right, so if it's by water and you're going from Asia to the Western Hemisphere, that means Japan's going to have to create a trade network, I don't know, I guess the Pacific Ocean, right, between itself and, I don't know, the Americas. It's not something Japan was in a place to do at that particular time. You'd have to have a very powerful navy to do that. So you're going to cross off choice number 1. That doesn't make any sense. Number 2 is our answer, but let's look at 3 and 4 here. Gaining worldwide recognition for its large empire. It didn't have a large empire yet. It would by World War II, but first you have to become modern to get the technology necessary to create the empire. So crossed off choice number 3. Decreasing its cultural and economic ties throughout Asia. That's not the goal. Why would you want to decrease ties, right? You want to increase ties. You want to increase trade, ideally, right? Because that will help you modernize and get the natural resources that you need to build factories, right? Remember, Japan lacks natural resources for the most part. So if Japan's going to be a modern industrial country, you're going to have more economic ties throughout Asia, right? So maybe they're not going to have an economic tie across the Pacific Ocean to the Western Hemisphere just yet, but certainly throughout Asia, they're going to try to increase their trade, right? And we know that Japan historically had, at least before World War II, pushed into China and Korea quite a bit to get access to natural resources. Okay, so choice 2 is going to be our answer, matching the technological and industrial advancements of the Western nations, right? AKA, they wanted to modernize their society, right? When you see Meiji, you think modernize. Number 2 is the answer for number 10. Let's keep going. Okay, questions 11 and 12 correspond with the source here that says President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, 1918. Okay, so this is during the Paris Peace Conference, meaning after World War I, what could we do to make sure that another one never happens again? That was like the goal of like Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, like 14 items. Basically, if we follow these 14 things, we can avoid World War II. It's kind of like how I like to think of the 14 points. Okay, so let's take a look together. An independent Polish state should be erected, which would include the territories inhabited by the indisputably Polish populations. So they're going to create a country for Polish people, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant, meaning agreement. Okay, so we're going to create a country for Polish people, whereas before they didn't have one, and that country would be recognized and protected by the international community. Next. A general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. An association of nations that protects countries. Okay, that's a fancy way of saying that Woodrow Wilson's arguing for something called the League of Nations. Right? The countries of the world would work together to keep peace and protect each other in case a conflict does happen. This was controversial, right? Because maybe that means that individual states would have to relinquish some of their individual power for the sake of like international government, right? So maybe that's why the US did not join the League of Nations despite Woodrow Wilson, the president, coming up with the idea. Okay, so he wants to do 2 things in this selection from his 14 points, right? Point 13, point 14. Point 13 here, he's arguing for something that we call self-determination. What is self-determination? Self-determination, forgive my handwriting here, is the idea that every ethnic group or every nation, you can kind of use those terms interchangeably. Remember, nation is not necessarily a country. It's a group of people with a shared language, culture, heritage. You can use that and ethnic group kind of similarly. Okay? So with self-determination, the idea is if you give each ethnic group its own country, they'll be happy, right? They'll be able to rule over themselves, create their own government without interference. And people that have this are going to be happier, and they're going to be less aggressive, and therefore will have more peace in the world. Sounds like a good idea on paper, right? Every group is going to have its own territory, but it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to like go to a map and draw a circle around just the Polish parts of Europe, right? You're going to leave somebody out, right? Or maybe there's some people in that area that are not Polish in that circle that you just drew, right? So what happens then? Now you just created a minority group in this giant country that's supposed to be just for Polish people. Right, so self-determination and redrawing maps after World War I is going to cause a lot of problems later on in Europe. Okay, but that's what Woodrow Wilson's arguing for here. Self-determination of people if they want it. And we need a League of Nations to protect countries in the world once they're created. So, number 11 here. Which concept is best supported by the information in Article 13? XIII is 13, Roman numerals, right? It's not religious tolerance. There's nothing here about religion. Social contract is an Enlightenment idea supported by people like Rousseau, which basically means that the people come together to create a government that both protects and restricts certain freedoms for the greater good of society. Okay, that's a great idea, but it's not discussed in the source here. Appeasement is not the answer. Right, because appeasement is when Britain and France gave in to Hitler prior to World War II, right? So that's after 1918. So self-determination is the answer, right? Giving ethnic groups, giving nations their own country in an attempt to make everybody happy and prevent conflict in the future. Number 12. Which organization was formed in response to the concerns addressed in 14? We already talked about it, right? It's the League of Nations. But let's look at the other ones as well. The European Union begins in like the 1990s. That the roots of the EU began probably in the 1940s and 50s, but the official European Union is the 1990s, long after 1918. And this is more like of an economic union, right? When the European countries agreed to not tax goods moving between borders and allowing immigration between countries to be a lot easier and using a common currency. That has nothing to do with Article 14 here. So we cross off choice number 1. Warsaw Pact was the alliance of Eastern European states with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, right, to protect the Eastern countries. Nothing to do with the League of Nations or Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The World Trade Organization appears after World War II. And that organization is designed to try to keep free trade happening in the world and resolving trade disputes between countries, right? So kind of eliminating barriers to trade. Nothing to do with Woodrow Wilson saying we need guarantees of political independence by having an association of nations. Okay, that's like an economic thing. So choice 2, like I said, League of Nations is the answer for number 12. Let's keep going. Okay, so questions 13 and 14 correspond with a source from Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1933. Okay, Ataturk is a nationalist leader of Turkey, and you can kind of equate him in your mind to like Meiji. He's like the Meiji of Turkey. Wants to modernize his society, make it strong, make it powerful, because if you think about the time period in which he was in power, Turkey had just emerged from basically having the Ottoman Empire collapse all around it. And the new Turkish state was basically what was left over after the Ottomans had collapsed. So it's almost like, all right, what can we do to modernize and strengthen the country to make sure that we don't lose at least Turkey? Okay, so that was Ataturk's goal, was to make sure that Turkey was going to remain strong and independent, despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire had collapsed all around it. So let's take a look at the source. My citizens, we have accomplished many and great tasks in a short time. The greatest of these is the Turkish Republic, right? The new Turkey, the new Turkish state, no more Ottoman Empire. And the word republic is significant as well, right? A republic is when the people can elect representatives. Before the Turkish Republic, you had the Ottoman Empire, and those were absolute leaders with no democracy. So the greatest of these is the Turkish Republic, the basis of which is the Turkish heroism and the great Turkish culture. So Turkish heroism, meaning they fought against the British and the French to remain independent, despite the British and the French grabbing up a lot of other Ottoman territories. We owe this success to the cooperative progress of the Turkish nation and its valuable army. However, we can never consider what we have achieved to be sufficient, because we must and are determined to accomplish even more and greater tasks. So they're gonna have to modernize and strengthen themselves a lot more. We shall raise our country to the level of the most prosperous and civilized nations of the world. Right? So they're going to bring themselves up, right, to the rest of the world. They're going to modernize and get up to date. We shall endow our nation with the broadest means and sources of welfare. We shall raise our national culture above the contemporary level of civilization. So we're going to catch up, and then we're going to leap forward and be like a leader on the world stage, right? So which claim is being made by this passage? Islamic law is the foundation of Turkish society. Definitely not. It's not discussed in the source, right? And Turkey is now a republic, a modern society based on Western ideas, not Islamic law. Choice 2, the Turkish nation needs to remain isolated to survive. It's not in the source, right? He's not saying we have to disconnect ourselves from the world and world trade. So we're going to cross that out, right? It's not a claim being made here. Choice 4, a policy of imperialism is essential if Turkey is to grow. It's not mentioned in the source. He doesn't say we have to go conquer other places to get stronger. He just says we're going to have to get stronger and more modern. But Turkey has the potential to become a world leader is absolutely our answer here, right? Because he says right at the end here, we shall raise our national culture above the contemporary level of civilization, right? So basically, we're going to take the lead in the process of becoming modern and having progress. That sounds to me like a world leader. 14. Which concept is most closely associated with the ideas expressed in this passage? This is a tough one. The answer is going to be westernization. When you see westernization, you think copying what the West was doing. What's the West, you might ask? It's Western European countries and the United States, right? So whatever those countries were doing, we're going to do the same thing. That's why I said before that Ataturk can kind of be equated to Meiji, because he did the same thing in Japan, right? So when you see westernization, you might also think modernization. Theocracy is a government ruled by religious leaders. Certainly not happening here. Socialism, to kind of simplify it for now, is the idea that the government controls the means of production, right, and owns the land in society and tries to create like a classless society where things are a little bit more equal. Not discussed in the source. We cross that out. Non-alignment is the idea that newly independent countries during the Cold War would not pick a side. They're not going to join NATO, and they're not going to join the Warsaw Pact. They're going to chart their own destiny free of influence from the superpowers. That has nothing to do with Kemal Ataturk and the ideas of the passage, right? But he is arguing for modernizing his country, which is another way of saying westernizing in this context. So choice 1 for 14. That's a tough one. Let's keep going. Okay, so the source that corresponds with 15 and 16, you can't get much information from it. It's called Parallel Journeys and published in 2000. Doesn't really tell me much, but let's take a look at the content in the source. It was dangerous to stand out from the crowd because of illness or any other reason. Once a prisoner became known to the guards, he or she was a target for abuse or special treatment. By staying invisible, by being nothing more than the number tattooed on your forearm, you stood a chance of living longer. Okay, so when I see number tattooed on forearm, I'm thinking Holocaust, right? Because the Germans did that to Jewish people in the concentration camps. Let's see if I'm right. Disappearing in the crowd helped Helen stay alive for the 2 months she was in Auschwitz. Okay, so I know it's the Holocaust now, because Auschwitz was probably the most brutal of the concentration camps, right? During this time, she survived 3 more selections by Dr. Mengele. In the last, she was one of 300 women and teenage girls chosen to go to another barrack. Helen took this as a hopeful sign because those selected for the gas chamber, another clue that it's the Holocaust, right, were never counted. Rumor soon spread that the women were going to be moved to a labor camp. Okay, so now we know it's the Holocaust, so that makes 15 pretty easy, right? The human rights violations discussed in the passage occurred during which event? It is the Holocaust. The Armenian genocide took place during World War I, in which the Ottoman Empire was trying to get rid of the Christian minority group. The Armenians were Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and the Turkish Ottomans were trying to get rid of those people. Right, so that has nothing to do with Dr. Mengele and Auschwitz. So we cross off choice 2. The Rwandan genocide took place in Rwanda in the early 1990s, and that's when the Hutu majority group tried to exterminate the Tutsi minority group in Rwanda, so long after the Holocaust. The Amritsar massacre took place in India just after World War I, when the British shot and killed a few protesters in India that were looking for more freedoms and rights, okay? Because remember, the British controlled India during that time period, during World War I, okay? So that has nothing to do with, again, Auschwitz or concentration camps. So choice 1, the Holocaust, is the best answer. 16. Which course of action was taken in response to the atrocities, meaning really horrible events, described in the passage? So what happened in response to the Holocaust? Well, it's not the issuance of the Potsdam Declaration. That's a tough answer choice. That's when America basically told Japan in 1945, hey, Japan, we've got this really new weapon. We're going to need your unconditional surrender, or we're going to use it. Then they used the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nothing to do with the source. Creation of the policy of containment? No, that's when the US was trying to prevent the spread of communism. That doesn't happen in reaction to the Holocaust. That makes no sense. So we're down to 3 and 4, right? Always use process of elimination. Holding of criminal trials at Nuremberg is the answer, right? They put Nazis on trial for their war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? Crimes like genocide, right? So those trials had to happen first before the Nazis were found guilty. So that's our answer for 16. Signing of the Treaty of Versailles, that happened long before the Holocaust, right? That happened in 1919. So we cross off choice 4. So 3 is our answer for 16. Okay, so questions 17 and 18 correspond with the source, titled Hiroshima, and it was published in 1946, right? So when I see Hiroshima 1946, it's like World War II times, right? It's 1946 is when World War II was already over, but I'm sure the people of Hiroshima were still feeling the effects of World War II, right? Because they got hit with the atomic bomb. Let's take a look at the source together. From the mound, Mr. Tanamoto saw an astonishing panorama. Not just a patch of koi, as he had expected, but as much of Hiroshima as he could see through the clouded air was giving off a thick, dreadful fog, right, or miasma in the source, right? So a big, thick fog, probably as a result of all the ashes and debris kicked up by the atomic bomb, right, floating in the sky. Clumps of smoke near and far had begun to push up through the general dust, right? So again, along the same lines here, a lot of dust in the air from the destruction, right? He wondered how such extensive damage could have been dealt out of a silent sky. Even a few planes far up would have been audible. Houses nearby were burning, and when huge drops of water the size of marbles began to fall, he half thought that they must be coming from the hoses of firemen fighting the blazes. They were actually drops of condensed moisture falling from the turbulent tower of dust, heat, and fission fragments that had already risen miles into the sky above Hiroshima. Okay, so the source is talking about the destruction of the atomic bomb, right? The fact that buildings were burning, people lost their lives, a lot of debris got kicked up and made things dark and cloudy and smoky. So let's take a look at the question. Which situation most directly led to the event described in this passage? So again, what happened first? What historical circumstance led to the using of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima? Rejection of the Treaty of Versailles? Right, Germany being upset with the Treaty of Versailles, right, the fact that they had to pay reparations and stuff like that after World War I has nothing to do with Hiroshima being nuked, right? Choice 3, Russian demands that the Allies establish a second front. That's the early 1940s, right, when Russia's saying, hey, the Germans have invaded us, a lot of Russians are losing their lives. Why don't you guys invade Western Europe so that the Germans have to fight in two different places? That has nothing to do with Hiroshima being attacked with the atomic bomb. That's talking about fighting in Europe during World War II. Evacuation of the Chinese nationalist forces to Taiwan, that occurred during the Chinese Civil War, right, in the 1940s, when the communists finally win and turn China into communist China. Again, nothing to do with Japan. Japanese aggression in the Pacific is the answer. What's the example? The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, right? And the Japanese creating a massive empire in Southeast Asia and East Asia, right? Maybe even taking away some lands that were once owned by the Europeans. That leads to animosity, resentment amongst the Europeans and Americans, and the desire to go to war against Japan and win, by any means necessary, I guess you could say, right? So choice 2 for number 17. The event described in this passage resulted in. Okay, so now what happens after the passage, right? The expansion of World War II into Asia? Nope, that's certainly not going to be the answer. World War II was already happening in Asia before the source was written. Hiroshima's emergence as an important center for trade? Not going to be the case if it's destroyed from the atomic bomb, right? An international agreement banning chemical weapons. That might have been created, in fact it was, but atomic bombs are not chemical weapons, right? They're atomic weapons. So we cross off choice 3. The development of a new type of arms race is the answer. And that's kind of a vague statement, right? Arms race means competition to build weapons, and the arms race is the US versus the Soviet Union, and the type of weapon is nuclear weapons, right? Atomic weapons. Which superpower could build more and better atomic bombs? Right? That happens right after the use of the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union's like, whoa, we got to have that too, or else we're going to be at an extreme disadvantage as compared to like the United States, right? So number 4 is the best answer for number 18. Let's keep going. All right, so we get a little break from the reading here with questions 19 and 20. We've got a political cartoon saying, let's get a lock for this thing. So let's put this thing back in the box. This is a tough one, right? Because you kind of have to know these faces a little bit too. And I see this face here, and I see this face here, and I'm seeing 1962, and I know that this is going to be President Kennedy of the United States, and I know this is going to be Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. Again, I know that because I can kind of see their likeness, and I see the time period. So these two guys are looking to lock up something in a box here. What's that thing? nuclear war. And this hand reaching out here kind of represents, I suppose, like destruction. So they're trying to lock nuclear war in the box, I guess, like prevent it from happening, try to make sure that it never happens, put that technology away so no one ever uses it. I guess those are the themes of the political cartoon, right? So number 19 says, this political cartoon is most closely associated with which world event of the 20th century? So some event that corresponds with nuclear weapons, right? It's not going to be the Korean War. No nuclear weapons were used during the Korean War. The only time in history where nuclear weapons were used to this point is World War II. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that happened beginning in 1979 when the Soviet Union was trying to put communism into Afghanistan or support a communist government in Afghanistan. No nuclear weapons were used, and that's long after 1962. The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, that has to do with nuclear technology, sure, but that's a nuclear power plant, not a nuclear bomb. Okay, so we're going to cross that one off. That's tricky. The Cuban Missile Crisis is going to be the answer here, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev brought nuclear missiles to Cuba to kind of support Fidel Castro, right? Castro wanted to protect Cuba from a potential invasion of the United States, right? So that does involve nuclear weapons, and it did cause the world to have fear that maybe a nuclear war would happen, maybe World War III would happen, right? So that definitely involves nuclear weapons, and so does the cartoon. So number 2 is the answer for 19. Number 20, based on the political cartoon, what statement about nuclear weapons is most accurate? Choice 1 says nuclear weapons were largely ignored by countries' leaders in favor of conventional weapons. Well, that can't be accurate, right? Because it seems to me that nuclear weapons are not being ignored. There's a lot of attention being given to nuclear weapons, right? Each side is trying to build a whole bunch, right? To the point where the world has a lot of fear that a nuclear war might happen. That doesn't seem like they're being ignored, right? They're being built in new places. So cross off choice 1 for number 20. Leaders of the world encouraged the use of nuclear weapons to solve conflict. Can't choose that one, right? Because these guys are saying, let's put it back in the box. Right? We don't want nuclear war to happen. So they're not encouraging it, they're trying to prevent it. Choice 4 says the failure of nuclear weapons disappointed the leaders of many countries. Remember, they were only used once. 2 bombs, one on Hiroshima, one on Nagasaki during World War II, and they were successful in that they did work. They were successful in that they did cause a lot of destruction, and they were successful in that it helped the U.S. Force Japan into a surrender. So I don't see failure there at all. So you cross off choice 4, and that leads us to choice 3. The dangers of nuclear weapons greatly concerned world leaders, right? World leaders concerned about nuclear war. So that's going to be the answer for number 20. Let's keep going. Okay, so questions 21 and 22 correspond with a map published by The Economist in 2019. So a very recent image. And it says safety in numbers, NATO membership in Europe, joining dates. Founders, 1950 to 2000, 2000 to 2019, and imminent. Okay, so basically showing the process of countries joining NATO, right? And you can see from this map here that it's expanding, right? The founders are these light gray places like Portugal, France, Britain. Then the dark is the next wave, right? So by 1950s, Spain is getting involved, Norway, Germany, Poland, right? 2000 to 2019, these Eastern European countries are joining in, which is significant, right? Because a lot of these places were once part of the Warsaw Pact, right? But that's going to be gone once the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And we even see that some countries are joining imminently, meaning by 2019, yet another country is considering joining. And on that map here, that's going to be Macedonia. And if you fast forward to 2023 and 24, even more countries have joined in. Finland and Sweden are also members of NATO at this point. And if you don't remember what NATO is, right, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was a military alliance created by the Western countries during the Cold War to contain the spread of communism, right, to prevent the Soviet Union from using aggression towards countries that were capitalist and democratic, right? So let's take a look at question 21 here. The international organization shown on this map was originally established to improve its. So the whole point of NATO was to do what? That's going to be easy. It's going to be choice 1. The defensive capabilities during the Cold War, right? They're trying to defend themselves from the encroachment of the Soviet Union or the aggression of the Soviet Union, right? But let's look at the other answer choices. Participation in the economic benefits of globalization. That's more the European Union stuff, right? Economic union. Some of these countries are joined together in the European Union, but that's about economics, not about military defense. So you cross off choice 2. Ability to counter the harmful effects of pollution and climate change. Again, sometimes countries work together to stop pollution, but that's not what NATO is all about. Access to development loans by the International Monetary Fund. International Monetary Fund is an international organization that makes loans to countries that need money to develop like infrastructure projects. Maybe they're developing nations that are trying to move forward with their process of modernization. Again, nothing to do with NATO. What does NATO do? It defends countries, or it used to defend countries from Soviet aggression during the Cold War, right? Now it defends countries just in general, maybe from modern nations like China or Russia, for example, right? So choice 1's the answer for 21. Number 22 says the shift in membership after 2000 can best be explained as a response to the. So what's the shift? The shift is increasing membership in NATO, right? And the shift is Eastern European countries that were once part of the Warsaw Pact now also joining NATO. That's a shift, right? That's a shift in alliances. Construction of the Berlin Wall, that came down before 2000. That came down in 1989. So we cross off choice number 1. Formation of the United Nations also happened before 2000. Right? That happened in 1945, just after World War II. Independence movements in Africa has nothing to do with a military alliance in Europe. So we cross off 3. Collapse of the Soviet Union is the best bet here, right? Because if you didn't have the collapse of the Soviet Union, you wouldn't have Eastern European countries being free to decide to join NATO because they were forced to be part of the Warsaw Pact. But once the Soviet Union is gone, they could do their own thing now, right? They don't have to listen to the Soviet Union anymore. So choice 4 is the answer for number 22. Okay, so for questions 23 and 24, we've got a photograph titled Chile, 1988, right? And it says, ¿Dónde están? Meaning, where are they? And we see people holding posters that have that phrase, ¿Dónde están? With people on the posters, right? So I'm kind of inferring here that perhaps these people have disappeared somewhere. And these people that are in the street here with these signs are looking for these individuals. That's all we can really gather from the picture so far. So 23 says, this photograph shows women demanding information about their relatives who disappeared following a severe earthquake. That's not going to be our answer here because I know what happened in Chile in 1988. Before this photograph, there was a guy in power called Salvador Allende. And the military had a problem with him. He was kind of seen as being a little bit too socialist. And the military is like, we gotta get rid of this guy. He's a communist. So the military overthrew Salvador Allende with support from the CIA, right, which is the American spy agency, right? So once that new military government is in power that's very anti-communist, they do some sketchy things to eliminate people whom they suspected of being communist, right? So that has nothing to do with earthquakes. So we cross off number 1. Choice 2 says, while fighting in a war with Chile's neighbors, this protest movement has nothing to do with war against the neighbors of Chile, right? This has to do with people protesting their military government that's very, very anti-communist. Choice 3 says, after a mass migration, nothing to do with the image. During a time of political repression is your answer, right? Repression means people being put down. People were being arrested or executed for having socialist ideas, or even if they were suspected of having those ideas. That to me sounds like political repression. Okay, so certainly that's going to be the best answer for number 23. 24. Which group of women took similar actions for similar reasons? Choice 1 is going to be the answer. Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina in the early 1980s. Same thing. In the 1980s, the military overthrew the government in Argentina, and they were very, very anti-communist, and they arrested and got rid of people who they thought were communist sympathizers. Okay, so there was a protest movement that grew in Argentina as well to try to get the government to release these people and return them to their families. Choice 2 says British suffragists who marched in the early 1900s. A suffragist is a person who wants the right to vote, right? So women were protesting in favor of voting rights in Britain. That has nothing to do with Chile in 1988. Saudi women driving into cities in early 2013, not the answer, right? Saudi women were looking for the right to drive, which they got in, I believe, 2017, 2018. Nothing to do with Chile in 1988. Activists protesting the World Bank in 2002. Again, nothing to do with the photograph, right? but the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were protesting for the same exact reasons. That's why number 1 is the answer. And that's very hard because this is probably, both of these things together are probably events in history that your teacher might not have gotten to because it's very late in the curriculum. And these are pretty specific things. Okay, but just remember, in Chile and in Argentina, these are Latin American countries, right? Both of them had military overthrows of the government, and they began to repress people who had ideas about communism. Okay, so keep that in mind because it comes up in the Regents a lot these days. Let's keep going. Okay, just 4 more questions. And if you haven't already done so, if you're getting something out of this video, if you've stuck with me to this point, please do me a favor and hit that like button and maybe even subscribe to the channel. Even if you're moving into 11th grade in the future, I am looking to hopefully expand this into analyzing the US history regions at some point. So maybe this channel could be helpful for you even when you get to 11th grade. Let's look at questions 25 and 26, which are based on a source called The Killers in Rwanda, and it's published in 2005. Okay, so I'm thinking probably this is about the genocide that happened in Rwanda in the early 1990s, which we talked a little bit about before, but let's talk about it again. In 1991, while the attacking Tutsi rebels were gaining ground, speeches at Rwandan political meetings, notably at rallies held by the party of President Habyarimana and his ministers, consisted almost entirely of threats made against Tutsis. Okay, so we're talking about threats against the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1991. In Butare, home of the National University, professors vied with one another to publish historical screeds, meaning rants, and anti-Tutsi diatribes. Okay, so the professors are putting out information that's anti-Tutsi. In the broadcast studios of popular radio stations, Radio Rwanda and Radio Mille Colonus, apologies if I mispronounced that, the Tutsis were referred to as cockroaches. So these people on the radio stations were referred to as cockroaches, right? Not a nice term to call somebody. Announcers, the 2 best known of whom were Simon Bikindi and Kantano Habimana, used humorous sketches and songs to call openly for the destruction of the Tutsis. So on the radio, like radio announcers were saying, hey, let's get rid of the Tutsis. That's pretty harsh, right? Based on this passage, one can infer that popular radio programming did what? Gave hope to the Tutsis during the genocide? It doesn't sound to me like the radio is giving hope to Tutsis. The radio station is saying get rid of Tutsis. That doesn't sound like hope to me. Was used to help end the genocide? No, they're encouraging the genocide, right? Genocide means the destruction of a specific ethnic group. So they're not ending the genocide here, they're calling for it, right? Choice 3 says, was not well known in Rwanda. It certainly was well known, right? You had popular radio announcers by name that are being recognized by the people. So certainly they're well known. So that means number 4 is our answer. Was a propaganda tool that led to the Tutsis being seen as inferior, right? Propaganda is when the government puts out one-sided information designed to make you think a certain thing or believe a certain thing about a group or a policy, right? So when the government is saying that the Tutsis were cockroaches, that's another way of saying that the Tutsis are inferior to the majority Hutu ethnic group living in Rwanda. Okay, so 4 for number 25. This is a hard one here. Which situation in Rwanda led to the events described in the passage? So again, historical circumstances, right? What led to the genocide in Rwanda? The establishment of a classless society, that never happened in Rwanda, right? That's the kind of thing that happened in like communist countries, or they attempted to have classless societies in communist countries. Rwanda was not one of those communist countries. When you think communist countries in the Global 10 curriculum, you think China, you think the Soviet Union, you think North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba, right? Those are your big 5. There were others, but those are the ones they're going to ask you about the most. So not Rwanda. Choice 2 is the answer. We're going to come back to it though. Look at choice 3, famine caused by environmental disaster. Famine means starvation. Okay, starvation does not lead to genocide. 4, a large influx of refugees. That the influx of refugees, that's going to happen like after the fact, right? Once people are trying to flee Rwanda and go to other places, that's going to happen after the genocide, not lead to the genocide. So we're going to cross off choice 4. So why is number 2 the answer? Well, like I said, this is hard because even process of elimination is tough with this one, right? Because you have to know some of this background history here. But basically, before the genocide, long before the genocide, like most places in Africa, they were taken over by European countries, right? Going back to the Berlin Conference in 1884, the scramble for Africa, most of Africa got colonized, and that includes Rwanda. And just prior to Rwanda getting its independence, it was controlled by Belgium. Okay? And Belgium favored one ethnic group over another, right? There were two major ones in Rwanda, the Hutus, that's the majority group, and the Tutsis, the minority group. The Belgians favored the Tutsis. They gave the Tutsis special privileges, they treated them better, and that led to the Hutus hating both the Belgians and hating the Tutsis, right? There was a lot of resentment building up there, probably done with intent, right? If the Belgians treat one group better than another, perhaps the two groups in Rwanda would fight with each other and not be able to join together to fight the colonial power, right? This is a way of divide and conquer type of rule, right? So when Belgium leaves, right, when Rwanda becomes independent, the Hutus are like, well, we're tired of the Tutsis having special privileges, and they want to get rid of the Tutsis as a result. So these rivalries between the ethnic groups, promoted by the colonial power Belgium, is what contributed to the genocide, right? That's why number 2 is the answer for number 26. A very hard question. We've got 2 more. Let's wrap this thing up. Okay, so questions 27 and 28 correspond with the source that says, for thousands of years, Egypt controlled the Nile. A new dam threatens that. Okay, so a dam is like a giant wall that you can build across a river to do a couple of things. You can stop the water flow and divert the water to other places, maybe to create a reservoir of water, right? A stockpile of water that you can use in a time of emergency. And you could also, like within the wall, build giant propellers, giant turbines that you can use to generate hydroelectric power. Okay, so dams are an important technology. So let's take a look at the source. A colossal hydroelectric dam being built on the Nile, 2,000 miles upriver in the lowlands of Ethiopia, threatens to further constrict Egypt's water supply. Okay, so this is a weird thing, right? When they say upriver, it doesn't mean north, it means south, right? Because the Nile flows from south to north, which is a very strange thing. I'll show you on a map right here in the video. Okay, so south of Egypt is a country called Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is building a dam, and since they're walling off the Nile River, that means less water available down the river for the Egyptians. Okay? The dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia over the 4.5 billion Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Africa's largest, with a reservoir about the size of London, so a giant stockpile of water, right, is what the Ethiopians are building here, has become a national preoccupation in both countries, stoking patriotism, deep-seated fears, and even murmurs of war. Right, so the countries might actually go to war over this, right? Because water is probably the most precious of natural resources, right? You can't live without water. And if one country is restricting your water supply, it's going to cause a situation, right? To Ethiopians, the dam is a cherished symbol of their ambitions, a mega project with the potential to light up millions of homes, right? Because the dam can generate electricity, earn billions from electricity sales to neighboring countries, so Ethiopia can help power neighboring countries, and confirm Ethiopia's place as a rising African power. After years of bumpy progress, including corruption scandals and the mysterious death of its chief engineer, the first 2 turbines are being installed. Officials say the dam will start filling in July. That prospect induces dread in Egypt, where the dam is seen as the most fundamental of threats. Right, so Ethiopia is happy about this. It's going to help them become a modern country, but Egypt is like, well, you're threatening our water supply. This is also an issue, too, in the Middle East when countries like Turkey or Iraq are competing for control over rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, so competition over the water supply, especially during a time period of climate change, is a very big concern. So, 27. What is one concern expressed in this passage? It's certainly going to be choice 1, right? The scarcity of resources. Water is scarce, and countries will compete over the control over scarce resources. Outsourcing labor is not in the source. That's when factories maybe close in one part of the world and move to another because maybe they can hire workers at a lower pay rate. That's not happening in the source here. Overproduction of agricultural products. There's nothing in the source about producing too much food. So choice 3, you can cross off. And choice 4 says a widening income gap between the top and bottom earners. It's not discussed in the source. Right? But the scarcity of water is discussed, right? If water wasn't scarce, Egypt would not be fearful of the dam being built in Ethiopia. 28. Which claim is best supported by this passage? Choice 1 says infrastructure projects create jobs essential for development. That might be true, but that's not something talked about in the source, okay? It has to be supported by the passage. So which can I prove to be true using the text here? I can't prove choice 1 to be true using this. So cross off number 1. Choice 2 is the answer. Modernization benefits some, but presents challenges to others, right? The dam is benefiting Ethiopia, but it's now causing a challenge for Egypt. Lack of technology has hindered development in Africa. Well, remember, hinder means slow down, right? I don't see this because they're building dams and generating hydroelectricity. That's not a lack of technology. Choice 4, sustainable agricultural production depends on the cultivation of cash crops. Cash crops means you grow the crop not to eat it, but to sell it on a global market. Okay, that's not usually sustainable because you're going to probably exhaust the nutrients of that soil if you're just growing one thing. So this is wrong for that reason. And again, it's not in the source. What is in the source is the modern technology benefiting Ethiopia, but not Egypt. So choice 2 is the best answer for number 28. So that's going to do it for this analysis of the multiple choice section from the June 2024 Global History Regents. Please check out my other videos on Regents Review. I've got a ton going over the multiple choice sections, CRQ sections, and even some how-to videos on how to write the Enduring Issues essay. So make sure you study hard and good luck on your Regents exam.